Hello and welcome to today's lecture on World War II in Washington State. In a previous lecture, we covered how the United States became involved in the Second World War. And in this lecture, and then in that previous lecture, we talked about how the war impacted life at home, right? What's called the home front. We'll be exploring and reviewing some of those same themes in today's lecture, but with a very specific emphasis on the state of Washington and the impact of the war here, which was considerable. The war impacted every state in the Union and every part of the country. But certain states were tremendously impacted by the policies of World War II more than others. And Washington State was one of those that was greatly impacted by the war, politically, economically, socially, and legally. So we'll talk about some of those themes. So this slide just sort of reiterates how the United States got into the war. And I just want to reiterate a few of these things before moving on to some very specific impacts in the state of Washington. So officially, the World War II begins in Europe on September 1st, 1939. Keep in mind, the United States will not really be involved in the directly in the European theater of war until 1942. By labeling the official start of the war September 1st, it does, which is what we have done historically, and so I will do so in this class. But as a reminder, to do that greatly diminishes the growing tensions that have emerged in Asia. And in particular, China and Japan are fighting what we would constitute as World War II as early as 1937. So as early as 1937, there's war in Asia. There's war in, um, on the Chinese mainland between Japan and China. And Japan is getting incredibly aggressive throughout the 1930s and the 1940s with other places in the Pacific. So there's tension building, and the United States has a geopolitical interest in what is going on in Asia. After all, it has a territory that it holds in the Philippines that it took during the Spanish American War. It also has a geopolitical interest in what goes on in Europe. However, there is a very, very strong isolationist peace movement in the United States. World War I had traumatized the nation, it had traumatized the world. We tend to forget about World War I and how earth shaking and earth shattering and traumatic it was for the entire globe, but particularly to the countries whose citizens fought in the war. And the reason we tend to forget about that is that World War II came afterwards, and that World War II was a much larger conflict, and we're further removed from World War I. But it's important to note, and it's important to conceptualize the way in which World War I really, really traumatized an entire generation of Americans. And this generation of Americans wanted no more involvement in foreign conflicts. And so this peace movement, combined with the ongoing effects of the Great Depression, meant that there was considerable resistance to among the American public to entering the war. Popular opinion simply wasn't in a place that Roosevelt thought that he could engage militarily in this conflict or ask Congress for a declaration of war. It's important to remember that the president might be the commander in chief of the armed forces, but the declaring of war is a power specifically reserved for Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution. So, long story short, Roosevelt felt that between the general public's reluctance to enter the conflict combined with the fact that congressional politicians were reluctant to make a declaration of war, it meant that Roosevelt had his hands tied, even though Roosevelt believed that the United States, it was in their diplomatic, geopolitical, and material interest to be involved in the conflict sooner rather than later. All of that changes with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. That attack leads the United States to declare war on the Empire of Japan. And because the Empire of Japan was aligned with Nazi Germany, The Nazi regime declared war on the United States shortly after Pearl Harbor, and in response, the United States declared war on Nazi Germany. So the United States is in the conflict by December of 1941, right? So it begins to mobilize for war. Like World War I, World War II is what is known as total war, meaning that civilians are considered legitimate targets. There is no distinction between the home front and the front lines of the war militarily. But it also is a statement that economies are then geared towards the support of the war effort. That the economy, not just the people who are going to fight in the war, but the economy itself is mobilized for the war in order to contribute to the war effort. And so the United States does this. It begins to recreate the military infrastructure it had during World War I, but because its infrastructure is so much more developed, and because this war is a much larger war, it's going to have a much more outsized impact on the economy and society as a whole than World War I did. This economic mobilization for World War II, which to be honest had begun in 1940 with the Lend-Lease Act that we talked about in the previous lecture, that mobilization will put an end to the Great Depression. It's just what's going to happen. The United States spends so much money on the war, providing for its own military and its allies, that it creates enough economic demand to generate enough work to solve the Great Depression. Now, as we talked about in the previous lecture, that doesn't mean that Americans suddenly are feeling better about their economic situation, because as we talked about, and we'll reiterate again, there's going to be price controls and economic, there's going to be price controls, there's going to be economic restrictions on the economy, there's going to be rationing, there's going to be all sorts of things that mean that even though Americans have the economic wherewithal to spend, that they, for the first time in over a decade, Americans have some sort of economic security, those who are employed in the war industries, they don't have the material objects available to them, or the food objects available to them, to spend freely as they'd like. So let's just talk a little bit about Washington and the war. And let's think about it in terms of the economy. Washington benefits as much, if not more, than most states because of the war. And the reason for that is that Washington has resources necessary for the war effort and the capacity to provide for new industries for the war effort. And let me explain both of those. So you have the growth of traditional industries that Washington has always had: agriculture and timber. The United States and its allies need food. And so Washington farmers are going to benefit from the fact that they're incentivized to produce as much food as possible. And unlike during the Great Depression, there's a market for their food. Also, timber is needed for housing, for building military bases, for goods that are necessary for us and our allies in this conflict. So agriculture and timber, two traditional industries in Washington, are going to see an enormous boost from the war economy. You also see the reemergence of a shipbuilding industry. The shipbuilding industry was important during World War I, but when the demand for military ships collapsed after the war, the shipbuilding industry in Washington collapses as well. It doesn't disappear, but it contracts enormously. It is regrown in Washington. And Washington in particular becomes an enormously critical shipbuilding area for the war. Okay, it becomes an enormously important shipbuilding area for World War II because of the geography of Washington in relation to the technology of the war. Let me explain what I mean by that. World War II is different than World War I because of two technologies, both of which are not new, but they're vastly improved over where they were in World War I. So let's talk first about submarine technology. Submarines had existed during World War One, right? The infamous German U-boats, but they were not nearly as advanced as they became during World War II. And because of the enormous advancement of submarine technology, you needed your places where you built ships. And you have to build ships on the coast, of course, because you have to be able to take ships from what's called dry dock into an actual water situation relatively quickly. And so typically what shipbuilding places do is they have like a lock system where they're able to kind of restrict water so that a ship can be built in dry dock, and then you just sort of flood the ship. You release the lock, and then the water comes in, and you release the ship, and it can just be floated because these ships are too big to be like building them inland and hauling them to the coast. Just not practical. So you need to build near the water in order to do these ships. But if you just place it on any old coast, you might be able to build the ships there, but you might be exposed to submarines. And so ideally what you need is protected harbors to build these ships. And Washington had those. The Puget Sound was an ideal place to protect harbors from submarines in order to get to protect the shipbuilding industry. So was the mouth of the Columbia River, so Portland, Vancouver area. Those two areas were ideal because you could defend those water bodies from traditional ships and also submarines. The second reason for building them in those areas was improvements in airline technology. We're going to talk more about this in just a second, but the planes of World War I were built of wood and cloth. Okay, they were wood and fabric planes. They were biplanes. These planes were somewhat fragile, and they were limited in what they could do, and they were specifically limited in their carrying capacity, what they could carry. And so airplanes during World War I were largely used for reconnaissance. Yes, they might have guns and they could drop grenades, though they could do a certain amount of damage, but mostly they were used for reconnaissance and spying. In World War II, they're going to have offensive capability because they're going to be able to carry bombs. They're going to be able to carry more substantial firearms. And so and they're able to travel much longer distances due to aluminum. Aluminum is now the preferred building material for planes. And so as a consequence of that, right, you need to put your shipbuilding areas in an area that could be protected not just from submarines, but planes. The Pacific Northwest had that. And so the shipbuilding industry becomes really important in Washington during the war, right? It just does. Now, in addition to the traditional industries and the reemergence of shipbuilding, one other new industry emerges in Washington, and that industry is the aircraft industry. We now have aluminum technology, which I mentioned before, and aluminum is an incredibly durable metal, but it's also a metal that can be shaped relatively easy, and it's lightweight. That combination of malleability, which is just a fancy way of saying it can be shaped, with strength and lightweight, and then its weight being light, means it's ideal for building airplanes. And so that, combined with improved engine technology, means that planes now are vitally important to World War II. Now, in order to build planes, you need a couple different things. You need an existing infrastructure, you need aluminum, and you need energy. And I want you to understand that building planes is incredibly energy, it consumes a lot of energy. It requires a lot of electricity. It requires a ton of electricity. Aluminum requires a ton of electricity to make. And so If you're going to have airplane manufacturing, you need to put it in a place that has the energy capacity to make aluminum, to smelt it and process it, and then ship that aluminum to where the planes are made, and then have the energy capacity to make the planes. One of the few places in the country that has those things and an existing airplane industry is the state of Washington. So Washington had an aircraft company called Boeing, founded in 1916 by William Boeing, who was actually a logging magnate. His family's involved in logging, but he was passionate about, new airplane technology. And so he created this side project, in his family's mill. And you can actually see the original warehouse near, between it's close to Tacoma today, but there's a big Boeing Field Museum today in the Puget Sound. You can go and visit. You can see the original Boeing. They call it the barn because it was the original place that they built the planes. But William Boeing had gotten further and further into developing this, and became one of the most important airplane manufacturers in the country. So that existed here. But Boeing was able to get so many government contracts to build military planes, not because of his know-how. Lots of other places had the know-how. It's because the state of Washington had the electrical infrastructure, the power capacity to do the aluminum smelting and then to build the planes. Why did Washington have that capacity? Because the investments of the New Deal, right? In 1942, right, the same, basically the year that the United States is becoming fully engaged in the war. Remember, it's December that the United States declares war on Japan, declares war on Germany, but it's January, right, when it really becomes involved. So the same year that the United States really becomes involved in both the European and the Pacific theater of World War II is the year that these two large dams come online. And suddenly Washington is developing an aluminum industry and an airplane industry to build these things. The hydroelectricity made this possible. It absolutely made this possible. And so without the New Deal investments in infrastructure, the United States would not have had the economic capacity to do shipbuilding, to do airplane building, and do the aluminum necessary for the airplanes. Now, if you look at the state of Washington today, you might not know that we had a robust airplane and aluminum industry as part of the state, because even though Boeing is still here, and we still do a lot of the important manufacturing for Boeing, the most important manufacturing for Boeing takes place here, although Boeing will build some of its other planes and products in other locations. The most skilled labor takes place here in this state. We no longer really have an aluminum industry in this state. It went under the 1990s. But in places like Wenatchee, you had Alcoa, which was an aluminum place. Alcoa was all over the state, involved in our aluminum industry. In places like Spokane, you had Kaiser Aluminum. So aluminum was a big industry across the state. It's not so much anymore. In fact, there's very little of it left in the state anymore because of things that happened in the 1990s. But once upon a time, beginning at this era, it was a big part of Washington's economy. It would reshape it, and Boeing still is a large part of our economy. Now, some of you out there are thinking, okay, Dustin has spent some time talking about the war, and then we immediately jumped into the economy. Why aren't we talking about battles? Why aren't we talking about military campaigns and so on and so forth? Well, we're not going to do that in this class. If you took me for a different class, we would talk about some of those things. Like a class that focuses more on Europe or Western civilizations, we would talk about those things. And even in a more contemporary U.S. history class, like a U.S. history since the Civil War kind of course, we would talk about some of those things. We're not going to in this class, but it's really important to remember that modern warfare of the kinds like World War II represents are really not just military conflicts or economic conflicts. The United States wins World War II with its allies because of American economic capacity and production. The United States could outproduce economically all the other economies involved in the war combined. So if you took all our allies in World War II, take your Great Britain, take your Soviet Union, right? Take your China, take your France, right? Which France, it's a little bit hard because the Nazis occupy, parts of France, and the other part of France, it's called Vichy France. It's with a regime that's friendly to the Nazis. But like if you take all of our allies, and then you take our enemies in the war, right? Germany, Japan, Italy. If you take those groups, our allies and our enemies in the war, and you combine their economies, the United States still exceeds the economic capacity of all those groups combined. And what that means is that it doesn't matter how many ships you sink, or submarines you destroy, or airplanes you shoot down. It doesn't matter how many resources you try and deprive the United States and its allies of, the United States can replace it. If you sink an aircraft carrier, it can be replaced in a matter of days. I'm not kidding. They were building aircraft carriers in a matter of weeks. They were building ships in a matter of days. They were building, like hundreds of planes in a day. Like literally, they were knocking out multiple planes an hour, 100 planes a day, depending on what we're talking about. It was American economic capacity that won World War II. You simply could not deter America's economic capacity. You could not destroy enough of their war material to get them out of the war. By contrast, right, Japan and Germany and Italy, as the war progresses, will have a difficult time finding the resources and the technology and the military capability, capacity to match the United States. You start shooting down enough Imperial Japan planes, you reach a point where they can't replace them. You start shooting down enough Luftwaffe planes, they can't replace them. Which means that economic activity is very, very central to the war itself. It also means that areas of economic production become targets during the war. And so there was great fear and great precautions taken to ensure that the United States could keep its economic capacity. And there was a great fear that if you lived in one of these production areas like the Puget Sound or like the mouth of the Columbia River, that you would be a target for espionage and enemy military campaigns to try and destroy some of that economic capacity. Now, we talked a little bit about this before, and so I just want to remind people of this, which is that World War II brought about one of the saddest and most racist events in American and Washington history, which is Japanese internment. I just want to remind you that anti-Asian discrimination, that anti-Asian prejudice had existed in the United States and in the Pacific Northwest specifically going back to the 19th century. First, it was Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans who faced discrimination, culminating in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which at this point is still being enforced, even though China is our ally in World War II. The Chinese Exclusion Act will not be rescinded until the middle of the war, around 1943. But you can ban Chinese immigration and you don't change the need for labor by American businesses, which is driving the recruitment of laborers. And of course, American businesses then pivoted to immigrants from the Philippines, which is an American-held territory, and from Japan. And those immigrants faced enormous prejudice and discrimination. We saw how that was reflected in American immigration law, right? In which, the Chinese were the first with the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was first in 1882, and then renewed again in 1902, and then made basically initially passed in 1882, issued again in 1892 or reaffirmed, and then made permanent between 1902 and 1904. But then later, between 1917 and 1924, we see America engage in a whole host of immigration restrictions, of restricting immigrants coming from all over the world. And in 1924, within a piece of legislation, the United States bans all immigration from Asia. Now, we've talked about this before, so this is just a reminder. So, all immigration from Asia is banned in 1924. The banning means that when Pearl Harbor hits in 1941, immigrants from Asia, the Philippines excluded because that's an American possession, have not been allowed in this country for 17 years. For 17 years. And then you had, other restrictions like the Alien Land Act in Washington in 1921, which prevented anyone who couldn't become a citizen, which were specifically people from Asia, from owning land in the state. So immigrants have been restricted and they've been marginalized and targeted as a result of both federal and state and local legislation. And yet, despite that, when Japan bombs Pearl Harbor, there is widespread fear-mongering fed by the press, a press that is sensationalizing things, but also fed by prejudice in communities and prejudice in government against people of Japanese ancestry. And this fury reaches a crescendo in 1942. You have the most important media figure in the country. His name is William Randolph Hearst, and he owns the most important newspapers. Well, not all of the most important newspapers in the country, but he owns a lot of newspapers in the country. He's also heavily involved in other forms of media. And he begins to use his newspapers and other forms of media to claim that there is what he calls a fifth column, right? This like secret group of people who have been sent in, right, to the United States from Japan to sabotage us from within, to rise up and help work in tandem with the government of Imperial Japan to destroy America from within. It's ludicrous conspiracy mongering. To be clear, there's no evidence for any of that. And if you just think about it, right, on its face, it makes no sense. People had not been able to migrate from Japan to the United States for 17 years before the Pearl Harbor attack. They've been banned since 1924. So no new immigrants have been coming in since 1924 from Japan. Furthermore, in 1924, the United States relationship with Japan is fairly good. It really only begins to deteriorate in the 1920s and 30s, in part in response to the Immigration Act, what's often called the Johnson Act, Reed-Johnson Act of 1924. This act in which Japanese immigrants were banned is actually part of the process of a deteriorating relationship between the United States and Japan, which further deteriorates in the 1930s. You'd have to believe that the government of Japan had suspected that there would be war between the United States and Japan at some point in the future, and then sent in spies and told them just to be sort of like sleeper cells until they were activated, whenever that was, in order to believe William Randolph Hearst's conspiracies about a fifth column of underground terrorists and saboteurs who have been planted by the Japanese government waiting to rise up. It's ludicrous. And there's not a shred of evidence for it. But in addition to William Randolph Hearst ginning up public anger and resentment and fear against people of Japanese heritage living in the United States, you also have the Army. The Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, believed that the Japanese in Hawaii had helped with Pearl Harbor. No evidence for that, but he claimed it. He also claimed that there were as many as 20,000 secret agents of Japanese heritage in the United States, waiting to sabotage the United States. There's only 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry in the United States. And Frank Knox is saying 20,000 of them are secret agents working on behalf of the government of Japan. He's saying 1/6. Just imagine how absurd that is. Imagine you're in the room, you're like in a room with 12 people, and 2 of them are somehow foreign spies. Like, that's basically what Frank Knox is arguing. It is really, really, really absurd. His thought process, right, is, and once again, there's no evidence here. It's simply racist hate. But between Frank Knox and government and the fear mongering of the press, Roosevelt issues Executive Order 9066, removing all Japanese living on the west coast of the United States, right? About 120,000 people, removing them from the west coast to the interior. So what happened is a line is drawn, right, from the coast to the interior. The line basically follows the Cascade and Sierra Mountains. So the Cascade Mountains through Washington, Oregon, and then the Sierra Mountains into California. But if you were to see a map of Washington, it actually has one interesting diversion east. So for the most part, the line follows the mountains. What that means is that if you were like in Eastern Washington, you were of Japanese heritage, you wouldn't be removed, except for one place, and that's Yakima. The local politicians in Yakima petitioned to have their Japanese population removed, even though they would not have been affected by the original order. So the line was redrawn to move east and include the area of Yakima. So anyone of Japanese ancestry who lived west of this line of the Cascade Mountains and Sierra Mountains was going to be forcibly removed from their homes. They were basically told that they would have a few weeks to gather their things and report to a relocation center. Now the question is, how do you define someone as of Japanese ancestry? Well, the United States defined it as 1/8. 1/8. Which meant if you had, basically, right, if you had Japanese great-grandparents or grandparents, you were considered of Japanese heritage and could be interred. By the way, this 1/8 ancestry is very similar to how the Nazis in Germany defined Jewish heritage, just as a point of comparison. That's not to say, by the way, that's not to say the Japanese internment was the same thing as what happened to Jews in Europe in the Holocaust. It is not. It is not in any way, shape, or form. But the kind of race science behind both actions has similar origins, just to be aware. So, Japanese of anyone with 1/8 ancestry is ordered to sell everything and leave for assembly centers. I covered this before, but just be aware. They were not entitled to their homes and their property and their belongings when they left. And so they had to sell everything that they could, because they knew once they left, it would be taken by people. People would just move in and steal it and take it. And the government was going to do nothing about it. And the government made it clear they weren't going to do anything about it. So the Japanese Americans and people of Japanese heritage living in the United States were forced to sell things for little to nothing, because the people they were selling to said, hey, I'm just looking to buy it right now because it means I can get it before someone else. But if you don't give me a price I want, I'll just come and take it when you're gone. Just imagine that kind of sentiment, that kind of pressure, that kind of mood, the kind of feeling hanging over. So once they sold everything they could, They packed up what belongings they were allowed to take, and they went to assembly centers. Those assembly centers were usually, like in Washington State, there was one on Bainbridge Island. There was one in Puyallup, where the fairgrounds are today. There was one in Yakima, in reference to what we talked about a little bit earlier. But there were numerous ones in Washington. There was numerous ones in Oregon. There was numerous ones in California. So they went to these assembly centers, and from then they were moved to 10 permanent camps where they spent the duration of the war. Only one of those camps is in the Pacific Northwest. That's a place called Minidoka. It's in southern Idaho. The rest were outside the Pacific Northwest. They were in places like, the deserts of California, like Manzanar is the most famous there, or Hart Mountain in Wyoming. There were 2 in the state of Arkansas. So of the 10 permanent camps, 8 were in the western United States, but 2 were in Arkansas. And the Japanese will spend most of the war there. Towards the end of the war, the camps will be disbanded, but for the most part, people of Japanese heritage spent the war there. Now, the Japanese population in the United States can be divided into 2 groups. They're called Issei and Nisei. Okay? Issei and Nisei. Issei refers to the older generation. These were the original immigrants who had come from Japan before the Immigration Restriction Acts of 1924, before Reed Johnson of 1924. These individuals might have wanted to become American citizens, but they were forbidden by law from becoming American citizens. They could not become American citizens. So they lived here, but without the benefit of citizenship. However, their children, the second generation, the Nisei generation, were American citizens by virtue of being born here. If you're looking for a breakdown, about 1/3 of the 120,000 people who were detained, they were Issei. 2/3 were Nisei, meaning that 2/3 of this population were American citizens. Now, all people in this country, regardless of your citizenship status, are entitled to due process under the law. But citizenship does grant you certain protections. And specifically for American citizens, the internment of Japanese Americans denied them their constitutional rights. Specifically, it's very clear the Japanese internment violated the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 14th Amendments. Now, this is not a constitutional law class. This is not a Constitution class, so I don't expect you to know like the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments, but the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments have to do with illegal search and seizure, with a guarantee to a right of a speedy trial, and a jury of your peers, right? The 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments cover those things. And they're things that are granted to all American citizens. And the 14th Amendment guarantees you equal protection under the law and equal due process. Japanese internment clearly violates that. And many Japanese American activists took to the courts in order to defend their rights and to protest this. The most famous is a gentleman named Fred Korematsu from California. But another one from the state of Washington is a guy named Gordon Hibayashi, who also does it. In both Korematsu and Hibayashi's cases make it to the Supreme Court. Korematsu is the more famous of the 2 cases. But the Supreme Court, in an act of complete and utter cowardice that the court will later in the 1980s and 90s rebuke, the court of the 1940s said that this was all legal because it's time of war. So the court didn't address the constitutional violations that this clearly represented. They said that during a time of war, the president can basically do whatever he or she sees fit. It was complete and utter cowardice. And later iterations of the Supreme Court in the 1980s and 90s recognized that and said that the court of the 1940s had erred. And in fact, this was an episode in the 1980s and 90s so embarrassed the United States that we sent um, uh, restitution checks. We paid reparations to those who were still alive who had been in the camps. That's how embarrassing this episode was to the United States and how wrong they felt it was. Regardless, the Supreme Court does not weigh in, and this is where the vast majority of people of Japanese heritage, whether citizens or not, spend the war. Now, by 1943, members of the Nisei community, right, the American citizens, will be given the opportunity to serve in the army as a way to leave the camps. Now, they will not be allowed to serve in the Pacific Theater because there's still racist fears that they might betray the United States Army, but they are allowed to serve in the European theater. And about 35,000 Nisei choose to do that, and they form a segregated Japanese regiment because the army is segregated at this point. Life in the camps was pretty difficult. It was monotonous. It was humiliating. These camps are prisons. They're detention centers where people are not allowed to leave unless it's under supervision to go work in certain approved industries. But these are prisons. Now, the detainees were pretty well fed. They were schooled. But at the end of the day, they were prisoners. And this was humiliating and devastating to many people of Japanese heritage. So that's a brief overview of what happens to Japanese Americans during the war, of which a significant portion are from the Pacific Northwest and the state of Washington. Let's talk about other social impacts of the war in the state of Washington. As we mentioned previously, Washington is going to have a very, very large economic impact of the war. It has war industries here. But it also has over 50 military installations. Over 50 military installations will be in Washington. Some will be military bases. Some will just be areas that guard ports or key waterways. If you were to go to the mouth of the Columbia River today, you can see some of those places because they've been decommissioned, but they're now parks and you can visit them and see some of the bunkers and places where they were guarding the entrances. So you have, between the military and the economy, a large military or a large war presence, a large war impact. And that results in a population shift. About 500,000 people moved to the Pacific Northwest during World War II. That's an enormous amount. So you had the Okie migrants, which we spoke about in a previous lecture, but you also had large numbers of African Americans come here to serve in the military, to work in the war industries. Right? And you have to understand there was a draft during World War II. We talked about this in a previous lecture. There's a draft. And so, the male populations, 18 to 45 or so is men drafted if they are physically fit to serve in the military. That then means that a large chunk of the working population is gone, but you still need people to work in the industries. Well, where do you get that labor? Well, many of it is women, right? Women entering the workforce in the war industries. That will have enormous consequences for the post-war period, but women working in the war, earning their own paychecks, having autonomy and independence in a life outside the home that many had never known prior to this, right? But you still have a need for even more labor. And in particular, with the internment of the Japanese, you'd taken a lot of the farm labor population away. And so the United States decides that it needs to find another source of labor for its farms. And this is where they introduce what's called the Bracero program. The Bracero program is a program meant to recruit workers from Mexico to work in farm labor in the West Coast. Well, anywhere in the United States, but especially the West Coast. right? Now these workers were not allowed to stay in the United States. They were supposed to they were allowed to come in, they were bussed in, they were placed in specific areas where they were given shelter and food to work the crops. And they begin in California or work their way up north and then go, then be done and go back to Mexico. That was the intent of the program, right? You're recruiting them because you want their labor, but you don't want them to sell in the United States. That is led many people to say that the Bracero program was an inherently racist program from the start. And it's hard to argue against that because you were wanting labor from Mexico without giving them the opportunity or the choice to settle in the United States. Now, this then created the Bracero program will last until the 1960s. But even beyond the 1960s, this creates a culture in which agriculture in the United States becomes dependent on labor from Mexico and greater Latin America. And that will then lead to migration and immigration trends in this country that are still defining and important for understanding this country today. And this program that started this entire history of agricultural reliance on labor from Mexico and Latin America begins in World War II with the Bracero program. But it begins with a program which, in its conception, is designed to be exclusionary. It's designed to recruit labor without giving them the opportunity to sell in the United States. And that, in and of itself, is a particularly racist construct when you think about it, because you want labor from a group, but you don't want to give them the right to settle in the country where they are working. In addition to the social changes, they were just daily things that I addressed in one of the other lectures. I'm just going to reiterate here that people in Washington had to deal with, which is night blackouts, where where private residences and most businesses were not allowed to have electricity at night, so that cities would not be illuminated, so they couldn't be seen from the air by airplanes that might be going on bombing runs. That people were required to have blackout shades in their homes so that when they were lighting their homes with fires and candles at night, that light didn't seep out to let someone from above see. You had the militarization of public and private spaces, right? It was quite common to see anti-aircraft, anti-aircraft weapons on the roofs of buildings or in parks in case there was an air raid. You had like even things where factories were camouflaged. Like these factories, they had windows that were painted black so that these factories that ran 24 hours a day and had to be lit, no light would get outside. They painted the tops of factories. You can't see it today in the state of Washington. The only place I know of you can still see it, and it may not even be visible now, is in San Diego. There's a Lockheed Martin manufacturing plant in San Diego that still has this. At least it did in the early 2000s when I saw it. It may not be that way anymore. If you got up on a hill in San Diego and looked down on it, you could see the roof of the Lockheed Martin factory was painted to look like a park. It had like ponds and trees and benches and bushes all painted in, so that when you flew over it, it looked like you were flying over woodlands or a park. Why? It was camouflaging the building for anyone who was flying above during the daytime. And almost every factory in Washington had such a thing. So my point is that no matter who you were, you felt the strain of the war, either from the rationing of food and the war bonds, the rationing of fuel, the rationing of clothing, the night blackouts, the night raid sirens, the militarization of your public spaces, the fact that members of the family were working in war industries because their spouses, their brothers, their sons were serving in the war. you had this entire mobilization of society. Everyone felt it. Everyone felt it. One of the last things I want to talk about is something that is really, really important for understanding the post World War II period and the ending of World War II. So, as many of you know, World War II ended in the Pacific Theater with the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on Japan. The first, August 6, 1945, at Hiroshima, and the second, August 9th, 1945, at Nagasaki. The United States decided to start a nuclear project in the in order to develop an atomic weapon before the Germans could get it. This decision was made by the Roosevelt administration in 1942 when they started what was called the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was designed to develop a atomic weapon. It's what it was designed to do. And so the Manhattan Project came into existence in 1942 with the specific goal to conduct atomic/nuclear research and develop an atomic bomb and to figure out how best to achieve that. Now, once the decision had been made to create the Manhattan Project, they then had to select sites in which this research could be conducted, in which this material could be produced. And they wanted to create sites that were isolated enough that they could conduct the tests without being near massive civilian populations, but also they wanted to be able to control the environment away to prevent espionage. But there were also things they were going to need. They were going to need access to water, and they were going to need access to electricity. And so they began to look for areas in which to put these research and production facilities. And one of the most important facilities was placed in the southeastern part of Washington in a place called Hanford. Now, the area around Hanford at the time was a farming community. And the government went in there and basically placed notices condemning all the properties, saying that it was now U.S. government property. They were invoking something known as eminent domain. Now, eminent domain is a power granted to the federal government and to state and local governments under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, in which land can be seized for the public good and just compensation has to be offered. So the federal government went in there and basically told people, pack up your things, you're leaving. They condemned their homes, did not allow anyone to live there, and then compensated them for their land at what at the time was fair market value. They then set about building the Hanford nuclear facility. And Hanford that site was selected because, one, it was isolated, and two, it had really good access to the Columbia River, which you could use for electricity or for the water itself for cooling the reactors that they were going to build. So Hanford became a very, very key research and plutonium production institution during the Manhattan Project. And plutonium from Hanford was actually used in the bombs that were dropped. So this facility played an important role in the war, but it's going to play an even more important role in the Cold War, which we'll talk about in the next lecture, which is a conflict between the United States and Soviet Union, in which the mass increase in production of nuclear weapons is really, really important. All right. I thank you for listening to this very broad overview of Washington and World War II. I thank you for listening. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.